Let's move on we're in the very last section now, 12 through 20. In 7 through 11, we talked about the author's instruction John was told to write. And now we're in our last section here. We want to talk about now God's power. Remember, we're still in the preamble. So Revelation 1 is talking about who is this that just conquered us? Who is this new conquering king? So we're in the preamble. We're explaining all that. We're going to really hit it hard in this last section. God's power. We're going to describe Christ in a very fascinating way. I think folks will enjoy this. So it says in verses, let's just look at verse 12. And I turned to see the voice that spake with me, and being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks. So there was a voice that was speaking to John, and he turned to see this voice. And when he turned, he saw these 7 golden candlesticks. Very interesting. We're going to look at that in just a second. In fact, let's do this. Let's go ahead and turn to Hebrews 9 now. Hebrews 9. And I think it's important that we take the time to understand the book of Hebrews as we go through here. I think, Jimmy, possibly when we get done with Revelation, Hebrews would be a really fun study for us to do also. It's
an amazing book.
Once you know Revelation, people will read this. If you can grasp what we're saying in Revelation, you go to Hebrews and go, that's simple. Because Revelation is saying the same thing as Hebrews. They're basically saying the exact same thing. Revelation is written in signs, and Hebrews just says it. So it's like Revelation, you have to go, why are they quoting so much Old Testament? Let's go kind of look at the sign it's saying. And Hebrews is like, I'll just tell you. But they're kind of the same material. So it becomes real easy once you know Revelation. But in Hebrews 9, let's just look at this shortly. It's kind of a longer chapter, but let me look at some of this. Then verily the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service in a worldly sanctuary. For there was a tabernacle made, the first, wherein was the candlestick. Remember what we just talked about in Revelation, there's a candlestick. The table, the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. Let's stop there just for a moment and just consider what we're seeing. The author of Hebrews, we're not sure totally who that is, but he is talking about the first covenant. We're talking about a worldly sanctuary. And he's using the word worldly here because he's going to juxtapose that with the heavenly sanctuary. Because remember, we have destruction of Jerusalem, and then we'll have a new Jerusalem, the heavenly city, a foundation not made with hands. And that's the one that Abraham was looking forward to. That's the one Abraham was seeking. He knew there was one coming that wasn't made with hands. And he's simply saying that in the first tabernacle, there was a candlestick in the first part. There was 2 rooms. There was 2 rooms to the tabernacle. And this back room here was twice the size of this one, and this is the Holy of Holies. And this is where only the high priest could come, and that's where the sacrifice would be accepted and would go up. This is Leviticus 16 stuff if you want to read about that. This first room here is where we have these different, I can't remember where everything is. We have the table of showbread. We have these different articles in here in the Ark of the Covenant, and it says in here, look at this, if you would, in verse number 2, for there was a tabernacle made, the first, wherein the candlestick, table, showbread, which is called the sanctuary. That's this one here. And then we talk about the veil in verse number 3. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called holiest of all, which is here. But look at this, which had the golden censer, the ark of the covenant overlaid round about with gold. And look what was in the ark of the covenant. It was a golden pot that had manna. This is representation of God's supernatural power to feed people in the wilderness. Aaron's rod that budded. So Aaron had a rod that was not attached to a tree that started to bud. That's a picture of Jesus. He has no root. There's a dry ground, and he is a root out of a dry ground, Isaiah 53. He's blossoming where it doesn't make sense. He's the originator of life. And look what it also says, and the tables of the covenant. Very interesting phrase, because I have people argue with me all the time that the two tablets of the 10 Commandments are not necessarily the Old Covenant. They talk about the Old Covenant being separate from those. No, here it's actually called the tables of the Old Covenant. Those 10 are the Old Covenant. It's literally what it's saying. And over the cherubims of glory shadow the mercy seat, which cannot now speak particularly, which bummer, can I just say bummer on verse 5? The author's saying, I can't take the time to go into this more. We don't know anything about it. And the author's saying, I can't really take the time to go into this any further right now. I wish he did. Verse 6, obviously the Lord didn't want him to. Now, when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always into the first tabernacle to accomplish the service of God. So what they're saying is there was these different items in here, and there was something called the daily priests. You could be a priest and come into this room, and you could swap out the showbread, you could swap out the oil in the lamps, but you had to be the high priest to go into this room. So there was a lot of priests that could go in here every day to maintain, but you had to be a high priest to go in here. And there was a veil that covered this thing. But when Jesus died, the Bible says in Hebrews that that veil was his flesh. So when his flesh was torn, the veil was torn, and now you're only authorized in this room, but guess what? The partition was taken away. He's made you kings and of priests, not high priests. He's the high priest. But you're made a priest, and you can go in this room. You cannot go in this room or you'll die. But you can go in this room, and look what happened, Jimmy. The division got taken away when Jesus died. Now I have access to the Holy of Holies, and I'm fully authorized to be in this room, but there's no division. That's what Hebrews is talking about here. And so we have in Hebrews 9, if folks want to take the time to look at this thing, it's a comparison of the old covenant and the new covenant. And so what John is doing in Revelation 1 is he's making sure that the readers understand that the voice of God, he turns to look for it, and it's 7 candlesticks. So it says in verse 13, and in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, a girt about the paps with a golden girdle. So he looks over at Jesus, who's called the Son of Man. And this is what I was trying to say earlier, and I got my words mixed up. I'm glad you caught it. Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man over 80-something times. But here's what's fascinating. Only 3 other times in the Bible is this used other than when Jesus uses it. 2 of them are by John, one's by Stephen when he's stoned. And so here we have, there's only 2 times we really need to pay attention to it. So he is connecting Jesus with this new heavenly sanctuary. And this is the theme through Revelation. This is what we're trying to get in chapter 1. We're trying to get this theme that Jesus is high and lifted up. He's at the right hand of the Father, and he has all of the elements of the old covenant, but in much better form now, securely squared away in heaven. Why is that important to the original audience? Because they were about to see the temple destroyed, and they needed to know that it was fine for the temple to be destroyed because it was left desolate to the Pharisees. It was no longer the house of the Lord. It was no longer Jesus saying, this is my Father's house, but he's recreating his house in heaven. And then when we get in him, he says, and your body is the living temple of God. So we are an extension of the headquarters from heaven on earth. And every time you obey him, earth looks more like heaven because the presence of God is flowing out of you. Every time you do, Jesus says, if you give somebody a cup of cold water in my name, Lord, when? Matthew 25, Lord, when? When did we feed the hungry? When did we give you something to eat? Lord, when did we do those things? He said, every time you gave to one in my name, you gave it as unto me. And the presence of God is on this earth every time we love people and spread the gospel. That's what Ezekiel 1's about, the wheel within a wheel and eyes round about. It's transporting the throne. There's a change taking place between a physical building and global presence of God. We don't have to pilgrimage back there anymore. I'm in a new relationship. I'm in a new covenant with God. So he turns to look at him, and then we're going to enter into the section of 14 and 15 and 16. Look what it says. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. His feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. His voice as the sound of many waters, and in his right hand the 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was the sun shineth in his strength. John says, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. Now, it's been noticed, and by the way, I'm going to show you, I think we've talked about this before, but I'm going to show everybody what a chiastic structure is, because a lot of the Bible is written in what we call the chiastic structure. Now, the reason it's called that is it's taken from the Greek letter chi, and that's because chi is shaped like this, like an X. Now, when we do a chiastic structure, we're only using one half of it, but this is what a chi is shaped like. And it basically means this, that in a chiastic structure, it means that in a listing of things, that the first thing and the last thing correspond to each other. In this case, there's 7 items, and the first and the seventh are going to correspond to each other. And of course, that means that the second and the sixth thing are going to correspond to each other. And the third thing and the fifth thing will correspond to each other. And there's always a middle one. And in Hebrew symmetry, in Hebrew literature, that's the one you want to get at. That's the point of the writing. It's the point of whatever you're doing in a chiastic structure. So really, in the Hebrew world, the middle is the point of your story. You work to the middle, and the beginning and the back work in harmony to prove your point. And they believe that that kind of check and balance system will make it to where you can't mess up. And so let's look at the chiastic structure. First of all, you see in number 1, you see he looks over and he sees his head and his hairs were white like wool. So let's go number 1. I'll try to make this to where it's not too difficult to read. I have white hair. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at the 7th one. And the 7th one, we're talking about his countenance in verse number 16. His countenance was as the sun and shineth in his strength. So we're talking about his face shining. So you have a correspondence in the first one talking about his head, the 7th one talking about his head and his face. This is in a reference to saying that if I have access to this one, remember what the golden candlestick was in the tabernacle. It's the oil. It's the presence of God. And so this candlestick, I look at it and has white hair and its face is shining. Well, of course, that reminds us of Moses on the mountain. It also reminds us even more so in Matthew 17 of Jesus's face shining like the sun at the Mount of Transfiguration. It is as if to say, when I'm communicating to you, I'm communicating to you through this presence of God through the top of me, the way that I'm communicating to you through my look, my head is radiant to you, likened unto the sun, where nothing is hidden from my sight, nothing's hidden from my speech. It's radiating as you look at me. Let's look at the 2nd and 6th thing. We have fire in his eyes as the 2nd thing, eyes of fire. And then, of course, going up to our 6th thing, we see that a sword is coming out of his mouth. So now we see eyes in 2, and we see mouth in 6. These are 2 forms of communication. This is me seeing what's going on and being able to communicate back to you. This is a relationship idea. The relationship of eyes and mouth is very powerful, that nothing is hidden from my view and I can say what I'm thinking. These are both communicative ideas. And here the eyes of fire is these eyes that are not letting anything get past them. They're eyes of judgment. And this mouth is not a normal mouth. This is what every king on the planet wanted to do but couldn't do, and that is having a sword come out of his mouth. In other words, his words have power. His words do not need minions to take them to do anything, but he can do it himself. This king is different. When he says things, things happen. It's a 2-edged sword that comes out of his mouth. And of course, doesn't that make sense? Because we're talking about the words of God, and the word of God is coming out of his mouth. And this is the 2-edged sword we read about in Hebrews 4:12. More properly, it's also talking about Jesus himself. All the history that we can read about kings, they say something and they need people to carry it out for them. They need people to go and listen to them. Jesus isn't like that. Jesus can see something through judgment and make it happen. He's the king that everybody wanted to be. When he says things, he just makes it happen. Let's look at 3 and 5. You have feet of brass. You have brass feet in 3. And man, Jimmy, we're going to actually do a study in brass as we get going in here. But there is a long, really cool thematic study we can do in brass. This is very, very, very much on purpose. This is a particular Greek word we're going to look at later in our study. And it has to do with a lot of the pagans used a lot of things in brass. We'll connect it to Goliath and a lot of things very, very particular about his helmet and so forth. It's very fascinating. But his feet were made of brass, as if to say, I'm stepping on all the pagans. It's kind of neat, but we'll look at the imagery of that another time. So you have feet correspond with hands. And of course, these are the relationship of feet and hands is pretty obvious. Obviously, you can be mobile. You can be mobile with your feet, and you can accomplish tasks through your hands. And when we do a study with the chiastic structure, it brings us to the focal point of the story, which, of course, the very center of this thing is this beautiful, beautiful idea of the voice of God. And the voice of God is where all the power is at. And so when we do a chiastic structure, by the way, all of Revelation is written in chiastic structure. And when you get to the very middle of Revelation in chapter 11, and you talk about Jesus, the kingdoms of this world are becoming the kingdoms of our God, is the middle of Revelation. It's the point of the whole thing. And so when you get to this voice idea in these, then you can hear it says, he has a voice as the sound of many waters. I grew up in Washington State, and I remember we used to go to Snoqualmie Falls a lot as a kid, and you can kind of hike down Snoqualmie Falls and get to the bottom. And I can still remember that as you're starting to approach Snoqualmie Falls, and I'm sure people have been to bigger falls in the world, but Snoqualmie is a very high falls. It's not tons of volume. It's very high. But by the time you get towards the bottom, you can feel it. You can feel it in your stomach and your chest, that vibration of the falls landing. And as you get closer, you can actually get quite close. People actually hike to like the backside of it and things like that. And as a little guy, my parents wouldn't let me quite do that, but I could get pretty close pretty safely. And you have to start really raising your voice as you get close. And I can remember people that are right by the falls are screaming at each other, and they're this far from each other because the sound of that water coming down. People should Google Snoqualmie Falls so they know what I'm talking about. And there's seasons for it as the snow runoff is coming down if there's more volume. I can remember hearing people screaming at each other because they can't hear each other at the bottom of the falls. And this sound of this one lampstand is as the sound of many waters. The voice and the power of Jesus is described as this. So it says here in the very last part of this verse, I want to show one other thing in verse 16. I'm sorry. And he had in his right hand, that's the strength position, right hand, was 7 stars. Now, this idea of 7 stars, the ancient world would have been very familiar with the 7 stars. The 7 stars make up a cluster known as Pleiades. And this is poetically kind of the idea in the ancient world of part of a necklace that would have been bound together. And the Bible talks a lot about it because the pagans really think a lot of these clusters of stars, and they would think they would worship them and get power from them. The Bible refers to Saturn and different things. But I want to show you a couple of places in here. Let's go to Job chapter 9.
Okay, while you're turning there, I also wanted to comment that whole description of Jesus was also described in Daniel, right?
Yes.
Was it Daniel 7 maybe?
Yep, 9 through 14.
Yeah, 9 through 14. So that was interesting. It was the same description, basically.
Yep. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, Job what?
This is going to be Job 9. Which removeth the mountains, and they know not, which overturneth them in his anger, which shaketh the earth out of her place, and the pillars thereof tremble, which commandeth the sun, and it riseth not, sealeth up the stars, which alone spreadeth out the heavens, and treadeth upon the waves of the sea, which maketh Arcturus, and Orion, and Pleiades, and the chambers of the south, which doeth great things past finding out, yea, the wonders without number. Let's go ahead and head over to Job 38. Job 38, just to our right, verses 31 through 33. Canst thou bind the sweet influence of Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? This is actually God talking to Job now, giving him all of these challenging questions. Job is wondering, why do these things happen to me? And then he asks him a series of questions. He says, can you bind the sweet influences of Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his seasons? Canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? And we could also go to one more in Amos chapter 5 and verse number 8. Amos 5 and verse 8. All of this is pointing to the fact that Jesus, the one that's speaking to John, is indeed really the culmination of all of these things that we've been looking forward to in the prophets. Seek him that maketh the 7 stars and Orion, turneth the shadow of death into morning, and maketh the day dark with the night, and calleth for the waters of the sea, poureth them out upon the face of the earth. The Lord is his name. The Lord is his name. So now let's turn back to Revelation and put some of this together. Revelation 1 and verse number 16. When he says in his right hand he has 7 stars, what John is saying is that this one that is the golden lampstand, this one that is the presence and the light of the Holy Spirit for us now in this heavenly tabernacle, he is the one that controls, forget the pagans worshiping the stars, he controls the stars. He's not just another pagan god, he controls the stars in his right hand that the pagans worship. And Jimmy, there's one more thing we can add to this that our first century readers would have gotten. And that is that on Roman coins that they were doing emperor worship, they actually had a picture of 7 stars and the Pleiade on their coins. And so if you're scared of the coming Roman-Jewish war about things which must shortly take place, remember this. Jesus is securely in heaven at the right hand of the Father, totally in control. And this applies for us today too. And in his right hand, he holds the governments. He holds all of the pagan worshipers. He is totally, totally safe and in control. And if we're in him, we have nothing to fear. So he says at this point in verse 17, and when I saw him, I fell down at his feet as dead. This reminds us of Ezekiel's, by the way, we should really do a comparison one day. This might be a supplemental video, comparison of Ezekiel chapter 1 and all of Revelation. You can actually see snippets of all of Revelation in Ezekiel 1. One of those snippets is in Ezekiel chapter 1, 26 through 28. I'll just tell you about it. Ezekiel has the same reaction. He sees a very similar thing and falls down as though dead. And we see this all throughout, that when people get a glimpse of who God is, they just fall down. They basically pass out. They can't take it. And that's why the very next thing, I fell at his feet as dead. And it says in verse 17, and he laid his right hand upon me, saying unto me, fear not. I am the first and the last. I am he that liveth, was dead. Behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. And have the keys of hell and death. Jesus puts his hand of strength on John and says these 2 words that we always have to hear when we come in contact with God or even an angel, and that is, fear not. It's the same words Joseph had to hear. It's these words, fear not, over and over and over, because we are fearful beings. And when we come in contact with the supernatural, our first inclination is, we can't do this. This is beyond us. And John, as he's seeing these things happen, where there's an image of the temple being rebuilt in heaven, and Jesus is now at the right hand of the Father, at the headquarters of this thing where he's going to take over the nations. And he looks at this structure of him, and all of these things, these all matter. All of these, and we're going to get into some of these in our study. We will actually touch on each of these in our 22 chapter study. But all of these have the idea that he can look anywhere, he can go anywhere, he can do whatever he wants. He's like stepping on the pagan idolaters, and he can hold the governments in his hands. He holds creation in his hands, and John can't take it. John just can't handle the amount of information. And he passes out as though he was dead. And Jesus puts his hand on him and he says, fear not, I am he that liveth. And for anybody, Jimmy, that's watching our video that may be struggling with things today, fear not. Jesus liveth. He lives. And we don't have to fear. If anybody is peddling fear to you, cut it off. Jesus is absolutely in control of everything. And I fear, Jimmy, I am concerned that people enjoy hearing people talk about fear for some reason, because it allows them to be controlled and it gives them rules they have to follow. Man, Jesus is my leader. And he absolutely is saying here that he lives. He was dead. Consider that. He was dead. but he's alive forevermore, verse 18. And he has the keys of Hades and death. The Hades is the place of the dead. It's talking about the grave. He's saying the place of the dead, Hades. So it's the act of sin, death, or the result of sin, death, and the place that death takes you to a hole in the ground. Hey, Adam, you were created from dust, and to dust you're going to return. That's your punishment for sin. From dust you were taken, dust you'll return. You know what Jesus is saying? Oh, man, I know how to unlock that. I'm more powerful than that. I hold the 7 stars in my right hand. The one that the emperors are so weak they have to put it on their coins to pretend they're powerful. I don't have a picture of the stars in my right hand. I have the stars in my right hand. I own this thing. I got you guys. And if you have to die for my testimony, I will resurrect you. I'm in charge of that too. It says in verse 19, write the things which thou hast seen, the things which are, the things which shall be hereafter. Talking about the things that have already happened is our preamble. That's one. That's where we are right now. The things which are, I believe, is going to be our historical prologue, our letters to the 7 churches. And then we get into prophecy in chapter 4 all the way through 19. That's the things that are going to shortly come to pass. And we'll highlight all those things as we get a little bit closer. And then I love this, Jimmy. We don't have to guess. We actually have interpretation. Praise God in verse 20. Here's the interpretation. He says, the mystery of the 7 stars which thou sawest in my right hand, the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are, this is the word messenger. This is the messengers of the 7 churches. The word angels is used, but usually when people hear the word angels, they think of guardian angel. These ideas have all been put around, but this word in the Greek just simply means messenger. It makes a lot more sense to me. I don't want to argue with anybody about it. If they feel comfortable that these are letters to angels, I don't think that makes any sense. I think these are letters to men to help them lead churches. But I think this talk about messengers. If people want to be a real stickler about it and say, I think that's angels, it's just not a hill I'm going to die on.
It means messenger. It could have been the pastor, so to speak, of each church.
And that's how I take it. That's exactly how I take it. Because the word angel here can be translated as messenger of the 7 churches. So I think that it makes sense that John wrote these letters and delivered them to people that will then read them to the people that are there. I don't know what good this would do to an angel, but it does a lot of good to a messenger that is trying to explain this truth to the people who are really going to deal with it. But people can have fun with that.
But sometimes stuff like that just makes me wonder why it was translated that way.
Well, because angels does mean messenger. We're the ones that messed that up.
But why don't they just say messenger right there instead of angel?
Well, because angels in 1611, when they saw this word, they said, "Oh, that's angel," because that means messenger. We are the ones that watch Touched by an Angel.
Michael Landon, man, I'm telling you, he was awesome.
Little House on the Prairie, but whatever. Usually you watch these different shows and you let people tell you what an angel is. You see enough angels with wings on it, you have an idea. But the word itself means messenger.
That was a chicken you just did.
That was a chicken. But
and I know because I have chickens. I see that every day.
So when you go out there, you can just say, "Look at my little angels." No, that's not appropriate. Don't say that. That doesn't work. And it says, so these 7 stars are the messengers or angels of the 7 churches. And the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. And this is important because what did we see in the vision? We saw the Son of Man in the middle, and we saw the 7 candlesticks around them. What he's saying is, this is no longer a physical place, but this is a spiritual place. And wherever my presence is, this light will shine in my presence. And so these churches are likened unto the candlestick in the tabernacle.
So he's saying, when you go back to verse 12, I turned to see the voice that spake to me, and behold, I turned and I saw the 7 churches.
Right. And in the midst of them, I saw one like the Son of Man. In other words, we should be laser focused on what connects us to fellow believers. Ungodly people want to divide us. Godly people want to unite us. Now, I'm not fluffy on theology. I think people can tell that by listening to me. But my goodness, if I'm in a Methodist church or a Lutheran church, and they say, we believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, he's the only way to the Father, it's by faith alone in him, they're my brothers and sisters. Now, we can talk about communion, we can talk about these different theologies, and usually these denominations will have something that is different, that's a distinctive for them. Yeah. But the thinking on this is, if you're in the midst of people who are proclaiming the truth of Jesus Christ, that's a candlestick, and the presence of Jesus is with them. And I tell you, there are so many people that want to say, hey, you know what? Come closer, let's whisper. We have the truth and nobody else does. That's dangerous. That is absolutely dangerous. And people want to say, you might as well crawl in a hole and die because we have the corner on truth and nobody else can figure it out. Nope, that is not what Revelation 1 is saying. Revelation 1 is saying that the presence of God has been multiplied. And when people have Jesus, he that has the Son hath life. He that hath not the Son of God hath not life. If you got him, you're in the shelter. His presence is with you. And there's enough of him to go around. So yes, you're in the 7 candlesticks. There's 7 of them. And one in the middle is likened unto the Son of Man. He's the oil in Zechariah 4. He's supplying the oil to light the never-ending presence of the Spirit.
And he has those 7 messengers in his right hand. He's like,
that's right.
He's like, I got you, like you said earlier.
I got you.
I got you.
Yep. That's why those faithful messengers will go there, whether they are angelic, supernatural beings, or they are men that are there to represent him accurately. He has his messengers to go and to tell the story. So far, folks, of the preamble, chapter 1. Remember what the preamble is. This is just basically saying, this is who I am. And starting next week, we'll get into Roman numeral 2, which is going to be the historical prologue, which is going to be chapters 2 and 3. It'll say, this is how we got here. It'll be a historical prologue. So unless there's anything you want to add, Jimmy, I think that wraps up chapter 1 for us.
If you like this video, hit that like and subscribe button. And check out the full episode by clicking the link below.